Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. We are exploring the book The Ancient Wisdom by Annie Besant. And today we are going to go through the first part of a chapter in which she talks about the mental plane. And she will follow more or less the same sequence. She talks a little about the kind of matter they are, and then the kind of consciousness that expresses on the mental plane, and then some phenomena related to it. In the next class we are going to discuss the mental body in human beings and how it evolves. So let us start with the general description.
Mental plane, part 1. The mental plane, as its name implies, is that which belongs to consciousness working as thought, not of the mind as it works through the brain, but as it works in its own world, unencumbered with physical spirit matter. This world is the world of the real man. The word man comes from the Sanskrit root man, and this is the root of the Sanskrit verb to think. So that man means thinker. He is named by his most characteristic attribute, intelligence.
So there are several things here. First, the idea that the mental plane is the plane in which the workings of consciousness manifest as thinking. On the emotional plane, consciousness working on the emotional plane manifests as emotion. Consciousness working on the physical plane manifests as physical activities, including the electrochemical reactions that are in our body, and anything that has to be with the physical interaction of atoms and molecules. So the mental plane is where consciousness expresses itself through what we call thought. But as Annie Besant says there, the thinking on the mental plane is not what we know as thinking down here, so to say, down. If you see the table that you have there on the screen, you see that there is the physical plane at the bottom, then the next plane higher than the physical, and by higher we mean that matter is subtler, and the frequency at which that kind of matter vibrates is higher, and therefore is beyond our physical senses. So the higher plane is the astral, although at the level of space it is right here, it's not up there. And then higher than the astral plane, which is the plane of the emotions, higher than that is the mental plane. The matter in the mental plane is far subtler, as we are going to see. Now, when thinking or when consciousness expresses itself on the mental plane, it has a completely different quality than when that vibration is transmitted to the astral and then to the physical plane, which is our brain. So in the Theosophical view, the physical plane is the last plane in a chain of causation. It's like if you generate a kind of vibration that generates a resonance in another kind of matter, which is the astral matter, which generates a resonance in another kind of matter, which is the physical matter, and then you have a kind of dumbing down of the vibration. So when we experience thinking through our brain, we are experiencing a shadow of real thinking, which we are going to see more or less what it means, because it's beyond our perception. But that's what Annie Besant says. Mind, as it works through the brain, not the mind as it works through the brain, but the mind as it works in its own world, the mental plane.
Okay, Ed has a comment. Astral is really emotional thinking.
Yes, the idea is that, for example, when human beings produce thinking, that thinking is affected by all the planes. Now, at this point in evolution, that thinking is heavily conditioned by the emotional plane. that means that most of our thinking is this kind of emotional thinking. It's a thinking that is, it's, well, as I said, heavily conditioned by emotions. At some point, or as humanity evolves, or as each individual evolves, that thinking begins to be more objective. And of course, the emotional components are part of the holistic perception of the person, but it does not condition the thinking. But at this point in evolution, the typical thinking is a kind of emotional thinking. Now, the last point here is that you will see in early theosophical literature that the word man is many times used. And, at this age, there is a sensitivity about the gender language, especially in English. In other languages, it's not so much. But originally, the word man didn't mean either male or female. That was the general word for a human being, as we say human now. And it comes from the root man, which, for example, in Sanskrit you have the manu. The manu is the thinker, is it's a part of rishis or divine beings, and the root comes from that, or manas comes from the same root, man, which means the thinker. Not because the thinking principle, manas, is the highest in human beings. It is not. Atman is the highest, not only in human beings, but in other beings. But the distinctive quality of a human being is its ability to reason. So that's why the word man comes from the root thinker.
He reveals his presence on the physical plane by the vibrations he sets up in the brain and nervous system. But in consequence of the coarseness of their material, they can reproduce only a small section of his vibrations, and even that very imperfectly. Just as there is a vast series of vibrations of which the eye can only see a small fragment, because it can vibrate only within certain limits, so can the brain and nervous system think only a small fragment of the vast series of mental vibrations set up by the thinker in his own world.
So this is again something very characteristic of the Theosophical view, which is not necessarily all that recognized, at least at this point in modern times. In the past, this was quite clear, but I think it has been lost sight of, generally speaking, which in the Theosophical view, our personality, with all the characteristics of the personality, and by personality I mean ourselves as we recognize ourselves, my body, the emotions as I feel them on the physical plane, my ability to think on the physical plane. This is the personality on the physical plane. This personality is a very distorted shadow of what I really am, of what you really are. And by really, I don't even mean Atman, the highest principle, and that's the universal consciousness, but I mean what we really are as an individual. So as we are going to see in the following words, this present manifestation in the Theosophical view is whatever the matter that composes our personality allows to shine through from the source, which is our higher ego. And our higher ego is at the level, if you see the chart there, is at the level of the causal body. The causal body on the higher mental plane is supposed to be the body of the ego. So that is what we really are as an individual. Again, we are a universal consciousness, but we'll come back to that later. As an individual, that's what we really are. And this personality is a very limited fragment.
The most receptive brains respond up to the point of what we call the great intellectual power. The exceptionally receptive brains respond up to the point of what we call genius. The exceptionally unreceptive brains respond only to the point we call insanity, but every thinker sends beating against his brain millions of thought waves to which it cannot respond.
So you see, in this view, the brain and the nervous system and the body and the etheric body too, the physical plane is what restricts how much of the soul, which is this higher ego and the causal body, how much of the soul can be expressed. At the level of the soul, every single soul is something that is far greater than what the person is here on the physical plane. And how much that soul can be expressed depends on the receptivity of the brain. So in what Annie Besant is saying there, we are all geniuses, but only a few brains are receptive enough to get the vibrations that come, or the intelligence, or the abilities that come from the soul. So we call that person a genius. And the difference is that he has a better brain than the neighbor. You know, generally speaking, there are a few more factors involved. But the point again is, the personality is a very small fragment of what we really are. And the problem is that we are constantly identifying ourselves with the personality. This identification closes the door more and more for what the soul can express through us. So the more we break the identification with the personality and begin to identify with the soul, the more the soul can be expressed through the body. Yes, go ahead, Ed.
This reminds me, they used to sell basically a piece of equipment that you could turn anything into a speaker. So you would attach to a table, and it would act like a speaker. And depending on what you attached it to, it was a better or worse speaker. You could attach it to a wall, and it was muffled, and it couldn't make out anything. You attach it to a plastic table, it had weird vibrations and things like that. So the same music was interpreted through all these things that were turned into speakers.
Yeah, that's I didn't know about that, but that's very interesting. And yes, that would be the idea. This is why many times in this view, when talking about evolution, there are always two aspects considered: the unfolding of consciousness and also the rearrangement of the vehicles of consciousness, so that they can express better and better the inner consciousness. So there is an aspect of unfolding of consciousness, as we are going to see in the next chapter, mainly a little bit about that, because at the beginning of evolution, the soul is kind of sleepy, and as it awakens, then it can have more and more influence on the personality. But two equally awakened souls will have different kind of influences on the personalities according to how receptive the personalities are. But to me, the important point here is we need to stop identifying ourselves with the fragment. We are constantly focused on the fragment. We judge ourselves according to how the fragment is, and we have to work on reversing that.
The mental plane is that which is next to the astral. Life on the mental plane is more active than on the astral, and form is more plastic. The spirit matter of that plane is more highly vitalized and finer than any grade of matter in the astral world. The matter is in constant, ceaseless motion, taking form under every thrill of life, and adapting itself without hesitation to every changing motion.
Now, when we talk about matter here, we have to understand that is a kind of symbolic language. Even on the physical plane, we know at this point that matter is not something really solid. Matter is also energy. It's energy in a kind of configuration or behavior that when interpreted by our senses, it appears as solid or liquid or gaseous or whatever state of matter. But it's energy in a particular way of behavior. When we talk about matter on the astral plane or the mental plane, of course we are not talking about anything that we think of matter. But there is in the universe, there are these two aspects. One aspect that is the origin of motion, another aspect that is the substance that is affected by that motion. So when we talk about matter, we are talking more about this receptive side of reality. And in the astral plane, this reality, the side of reality, what we call matter here, is very swift, very subtle, and very alive. Part of the spiritual work implies to deal with our personalities in different ways. In modern spirituality, or the superficial aspect of modern spirituality, tries not to focus on the need to rearrange our life. We can have everything, happiness, money, whatever you want, without having to make any changes. You just, I'll teach you a technique, you can manipulate the universe. Any serious tradition requires a certain restructuring of our life, our perception, how we deal with ourselves. Now, a problem with this is that when we start looking at the personality, we see its limitations. We see how it is faulty, how it does things that are far from the ideal, a series of questions. If we are going to go beyond that, then we need to be able to recognize this and to deal with it. There are different ways of dealing with it according to our maturity, let's say. But most people feel guilty about it, and that makes very difficult. The spiritual work becomes very difficult because we feel, I am this anger, I am this problem, I am this, and that makes the work very difficult. If we begin to realize that this is how our consciousness that is not limited, our consciousness that is far freer, how it can be expressed through these vehicles at the time, and we don't identify with the faulty expression, then it's far easier to deal in an objective way with how things are expressing. So that could be an example. There are many, many consequences that come from beginning to identify ourselves with something that is closer to what we really are.
Once again, here, the subdivisions of the spirit matter of the plane are 7 in number. These varieties enter into countless combinations of every variety of complexity, yielding the solids, liquids, gases, and ethers of the mental plane. The word solid seems indeed absurd when speaking of even the most substantial forms of mind stuff. Yet, as they are dense in comparison with other kinds of mental materials, and as we have no descriptive words save such as are based on physical conditions, we must use it for lack of a better one.
So again here, the question of the symbolic language, the mental solids do not think that they are solid in any way, but in comparison with the other subplanes or states of mental matter, they can be regarded as solid. Just as mental matter has nothing really to do with what we think matter is, as I said. But the idea is that every plane has 7 subplanes, or every kind of matter, the mental matter, astral, physical, or others, have 7 states. And that's a general trend in the Theosophical view.
These subdivisions are grouped under 2 headings, to which the somewhat insufficient and unintelligible epitaphs, formless and form, have been assigned. The lower 4 are grouped together as with form. The higher 3 are grouped as formless. The grouping is necessary, for the distinction is a real one, although one difficult to describe, and the regions are related in consciousness to the divisions in the mind itself.
If you see the table there, the mental plane is divided in higher manas and lower manas. So the higher mental plane, the lower mental plane. The higher subdivision of the mental consists of the first three subplanes, and the lower subdivision is the last four subplanes, so 3 and 4. And how consciousness manifests on the higher 3 and on the lower 4 is different enough to propose this kind of division or subdivision in the mental plane. Of course, any classification is artificial. You choose how to divide things according to a certain set of phenomena. Blavatsky, for example, many times would take the astral plane and the lower mental plane as a single plane, and then leave the higher mental plane as a different plane. And that is also fine from a different perspective. But as we are going to see, Annie Besant is going to examine this subdivision within the mental plane.
The impossibility of giving in words a lucid exposition of the difference in the action of consciousness in the two regions is due to the fact that words are the symbols of images and belong to the workings of the lower mind in the brain, and are based wholly upon those workings, while the formless region belongs to the pure reason, which never works within the narrow limits of language.
So she said the higher manas is, especially in Hinduism, you can see that quite frequently, is called arupa, A-R-U-P-A, arupa. Rupa means form, arupa means without form. So the higher mental plane is said to be without form, the lower mental plane is said to be with form. In Hinduism, they don't call it mental plane, they just call, the astral plane, they call it kama loka, the lower mental plane rupa loka, and the higher arupa loka. Now, Besant says this idea of formless with form, this is all based on words that are good for the physical plane, but they are not really good for any other plane, really. So again, she calls the attention to the limitations of language. Whenever we read the Theosophical literature, especially about the higher planes, we have to keep this in mind always. Blavatsky used to say, do not materialize the teachings. Try to spiritualize your mind while going through the teachings instead of materializing the teachings. So when you see this, do not think that the higher mental plane is formless or the lower has a form as we conceive that. Just try to have like the abstract sense of what that means. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I think a way of looking at it, one of the activities of the higher manas is, for example, compassion. So think about, how would you measure compassion? What is the form of compassion? What are the qualities of compassion? And that sort of gives you a feeling for the difficulty in using spatial terms or time terms with these properties.
Mm-hmm. Yes, actually, that's a technique many times used in Buddhism, that they, with the eye, for example, the sense of I-ness, and try to see how big it is in terms of yards, what color does it have. So it's a way to realizing that it's not really an object, and that's a good way to go about it.
The distinction may perhaps be best expressed by saying that in the lower four subdivisions, the vibrations of consciousness give rise to forms, to images or pictures, and every thought appears as a living shape. Whereas in the three higher consciousness, whereas in the higher three, consciousness seems rather to send them out as a mighty stream of living energy, which does not body itself into distinct images while it remains in this higher region.
So a clairvoyant that can see on the mental plane, most clairvoyants can't. The people who are born naturally with clairvoyance, in general, they cannot go beyond the astral plane. To see on the mental plane, the person needs a special training through yoga, and not by yoga, I don't mean the hatha yoga that we know, or even the reading the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, but by a real regular training. But those who could see the astral plane, they can see that whenever we are thinking with the lower mind, thought forms are generated. But whenever the higher mind is active, energy, formless energy, is generated. So that's how Annie Besant says perhaps we can, picture it in this way. Now there is another way that it may be useful, because this higher mind and lower mind on the higher plane, when they manifest through the brain, there is also a subdivision that of ideas that we can see in the brain. And this is the kind of abstract ideas and the concrete ideas. So this is an example. That doesn't mean that what we call abstract ideas are the higher mind on the mental plane. But the abstract ideas are like is one way in which the higher mind manifests in a very limited way through the brain. So for example, if I say triangle, you know what a triangle is without having to think of a specific triangle. But the idea is that you all know what a triangle is. I can show you very different triangles and you will recognize them because you have the abstract idea of what a triangle is. Now, when you think of a particular triangle with a particular form, then you can think, if you are thinking of one, you are not thinking of the other. So when I say triangle, if you picture this triangle is not this one and it's not this one. These are concrete examples of the abstract idea of a triangle. So the abstract idea doesn't have any form. But as soon as you embody the abstract idea into one particular form, you are denying all the others. So in this case, abstract ideas are embracing. There is no separation. As long as you think the abstract idea of triangle, all the triangles are possible there. But when you embody that idea in one concrete object, then you are excluding all the others. So this is what in philosophy sometimes they call the universals. So the abstract idea of a triangle is a universal idea, universal in the sense that it's not particular. And then the concrete examples would be the particulars. And this is, on the physical plane, on a lower manifestation, another example of the difference between the formless and the form thinking.
The mental plane is that which reflects the universal mind in nature. In its higher regions exist all the archetypal ideas which are now in the course of concrete evolution, and in its lower, the working out of these into successive forms, to be duly reproduced in the astral and physical worlds.
So if you want to build a triangle, before you can build it on the physical plane, you have to have the idea of it. So in Theosophy, it is said that the universe works in the same way. There is first the idea of a human being in the universal mind, and then that idea begins to be more and more concrete on the lower planes. When you get to the physical plane, you have the human being as we have it, as we know it. Now, this human being on the higher planes is the universal man, and again, man as the thinker, not male. And in some other traditions, like in Kabbalah, they would call it Adam Kadmon. This is the celestial man. So she says that in the higher mental plane are the archetypes. Archetypes in the sense that Plato used that word, not in the sense that Jung used it. The collective. Sometimes the archetypes were used more at the level of the collective unconscious in Jung. But these archetypes that Besant is talking about, and she was talking about this before Jung, I'm pretty sure, or more or less at the same time, then she's talking about the Platonic view of the archetypes. These are higher archetypes. These are the seeds in the universal mind that will allow the development and evolution of the different forms, species, etc.
Its materials are capable of combining under the impulse of thought vibrations. In that region, thought and action, will and deed, are one and the same. Spirit matter here becomes the obedient servant of the life, adapting itself to every creative motion. The mind stuff can there be shaped into thought forms that help or injure.
So on the physical plane, without going to, or looking into any other plane, thinking may be completely unproductive of results. You may think your whole life about doing something. If you never do it, then nothing happens. Of course, on the inner planes, as you think, you are generating karmic causes that eventually will have an effect. But that's why I said just on the physical plane, thinking is just daydreaming, unless you enact it and you do something. But on the mental plane, thinking is the mode of action of consciousness. To think is to act. To think is to produce. For the higher ego, what is his thinking is like for us our actions. That is difficult to really picture, but every thought at the level of the higher mental plane, it's a motion of consciousness that has built in a lot of information and energy and feelings that when that has to be expressed through the physical brain, that is degenerated, so to say, in a very limited idea.
The vibrating life of the thinker that shapes the materials around him give rise also to the most exquisite and constantly changing colors, waves of varying shades like the rainbow hues of mother of pearl, etherealized and brightened to the indescribable extent, sweeping over and through every form, so that each presents a harmony of rippling, living, luminous, delicate colors, including many not ever known to earth.
So that's how a person sees the astral, the mental plane, all this play of very, living and subtle colors and, everything that Annie Besant described there. So the life on the mental plane, you can see, is completely different from the life here. But remember that all these vibrations are actual actions on the mental plane.
Thought forms. Thought forms naturally play a large part among the living creatures that function on the mental plane. They resemble those with which we are already familiar in the astral world, save that they are far more radiant and more brilliantly colored, are stronger, more lasting, and more fully vitalized.
So we saw this question of the thought forms as they manifest on the astral plane. So if consciousness is working on the higher mental plane, then what a clairvoyant would see is all this streaming of light and life. If that thought / action is directed to some concrete object, then that streaming of life and light and consciousness would go to the lower mental plane and generate a form. Then if that form or the object is directed to something that has also an emotional component, that thought form will gather around it astral matter, and then we have this astral thought form. That is what we have seen a few pictures in the previous class. And then that comes to the brain in the form of an idea. Now, these forms, when they manifest on the lower mental plane, can be seen by a clairvoyant.
As the higher intellectual qualities become more clearly marked, these forms show very sharply defined outlines, and there is a tendency to a singular perfection of geometrical figures accompanied by an equally singular purity of luminous color. But needless to say, at the present stage of humanity, there is a vast preponderance of cloudy and irregular shaped thoughts, the production of the ill-trained minds of the majority.
It is said that Pythagoras, or sometimes Plato, said that God geometrizes. And this is an interesting aspect of nature, because a thought many times manifests in geometrical figures. And if you have, in our last class I mentioned these voice figures that were famous at the beginning of the 20th century. That was to show how even physical sounds, the vibrations of different musical tones, generate a particular geometrical figure if that vibration, for example, can be made to rearrange sand or powder or something like that. The sand is arranged in particular geometrical figures that change with the sound. The same happens at the level of thinking. It is strange to figure, why a thought would produce a geometrical figure or a sound, and this is the foundation for the idea of sacred geometry, which Pythagoras worked on that a lot, but we have very few texts that he actually produced. And in the modern sacred geometry, there is an intuition of this principle, but normally, at least the works that I came across are rather superficial. They are noticing certain patterns, and that's quite clear even for a scientist. Now the question is that patterns have some correlation with psychological states, because a psychological state, a thought or an emotion, produces a certain pattern. And that is a connection that is more esoteric, that is not being explored. But it's interesting to keep this in mind.
Ed made a comment that pi is involved a lot.
Yes. There seem to be certain numbers, and this is something that they can see in the sacred geometry, which is basically a derivation of science. Scientists know all this. They don't get any mystical, insight out of it. But pi and some other numbers seem to be at the foundation of certain manifestations in nature. Therefore, if we take it in this way, we can think that pi represents some fundamental aspects of consciousness. But as I said, unfortunately, I have not found works that really go deep into it, because it's quite an esoteric subject.
These thought forms are built out of the elemental essence of the plane, the vibrations of the thought throwing the elemental essence into a corresponding shape, and this shape having the thought as its informing life. Thus again, we have artificial elementals created in a way identical with that by which they come into being in the astral regions.
So remember, we saw that the astral matter in the previous class is animated by a certain kind of consciousness that we were calling elemental. There are three types of elementals or kingdoms: one that expresses on the astral plane, another one on the lower mental plane, and another on the higher mental plane. So matter is ensouled in the very astral matter, and in this case the very mental matter is being ensouled by this elemental life, which has its own intelligence. Now, when we think, we remember that thinking produces a rearrangement, a response in the mental matter, and produces a form. This form is ensouled, is animated by this elemental consciousness, the elemental kingdoms. Now, Blavatsky would mention in some of her writings that the way to manipulate elementals is by color, by sound, and by number. That this science of manipulating elementals, because with the elementals you can produce physical phenomena. You can produce rain, you can precipitate a physical object, you can even help or damage people. But she said that the science of manipulating elementals is kept secret because in humanity at this point in our evolution, whenever we discover a force, we use it for warfare. So, but when she says elementals can be moved according to color, sound, and number, she's referring to what we were saying, that there are certain shapes that can induce certain states of consciousness because there is a correlation. So number is related to the geometrical form, sound is related to the geometry, the color is related because on the inner planes every vibration expresses itself through color. So it's just something to point out as a general knowledge. Fortunately, all these science is kept secret for that reason that I said.
The elemental essence of the mental plane constitutes the second elemental kingdom, existing on the 4 lower subdivisions of the mental plane. The 3 higher subdivisions, the formless, are occupied by the first elemental kingdom.
Yes, I just explained that, so go on.
On the lower mental plane are seen many chelas, or disciples, at work in their mental bodies, freed for a time from their physical vestures. When the body is in deep sleep, the thinker may escape from it and work in these higher regions.
So now she's exploring a little about the inhabitants of the plane. And we have seen in the previous class that on the mental plane, there are, for example, when we go to sleep, consciousness is on the astral plane. And last week we saw that on the astral plane, you have some astral bodies in which, because they are very little developed and consciousness is very little awakened, when the body is asleep, consciousness is within in this astral body, but is as asleep as in the body. Then some other people are more awakened on the astral plane, but they are not quite able to use the astral body as a vehicle of consciousness, while others are able to use it as we use the physical body. Now, the mental plane at this point in evolution, let me say in the Theosophical view, there are 7 huge evolutionary cycles that are called rounds of evolution. We are in the 4th round, which means that at this point in evolution, at the 4th round, the 4th principle of consciousness is being developed, and that is the astral consciousness. So at this point in evolution, human beings are more or less aware on the astral plane, but not on the mental. For the most part, most human beings, when they go to sleep, they cannot go beyond the astral plane. In the 5th round, in the next round of evolution, then most human beings will begin to be awakened on the mental plane. But those individuals that are more evolved, for different reasons, not because they are better, just because they studied earlier the evolution, or they chose a more self-directed path, or some other reasons. There are a few individuals that are able to be awakened on the mental plane, and these are normally, according to Besant, disciples that are helped by the masters to be aware on those planes, so that they can do some kind of service on those planes. I cannot go into the whole subject of discipleship and the masters. We have given talks on that, and they are available on our website.
From here, he can aid and comfort his fellow man by acting directly on their minds, suggesting helpful thoughts, putting before them noble ideas, more effectively and speedily than he can do when encased in the body. He can see their needs more clearly and therefore can supply them more perfectly. Unseen, unrecognized, he works, serving his enemies as gladly and as freely as his friends, dispensing to individuals the stream of beneficent forces that are poured down from the great helpers in higher spheres.
So the idea is that, if, for example, if a person that you know needs some help, you may try to talk with this person and try to help the person figure out how to act or how to deal with the situation. Now, while we communicate on the physical plane, there are many conditionings that may make this communication very difficult. You know, the fear of the other person, the incapacity to see what you are saying, the past experience. there are so many conditionings on our physical perception that makes difficult the communication. Now, if you can communicate with consciousness on the mental plane, many of those barriers are down. There is a far closer communication with consciousness on the mental plane. Now, of course, how much you can communicate with the consciousness directly on the mental plane depends on how awakened that person is, how receptive that person is, and then the ability of that person to bring that idea down to the physical brain. But within a certain group of humanity, within people who are interested in spirituality and are trying to walk that path, this method of communication is not beyond reach. Even if the person is not fully awakened on the mental plane, there is some communication that can be done there. And then if this doesn't imply that you are trying to force a person to think in a particular way, just as on the physical plane, if you are talking with somebody, you are not forcing that person. But if consciousness recognizes what you are saying, then it's easier for that consciousness bring down that influence on the personality than if you try to communicate from the physical plane. So this is what Annie Besant is talking about, and it depends on what, as I said, on the level of awakening of the different people to see how much this can really work.
Here also are sometimes seen the glorious figures of the masters, though for the most part they reside on the highest level of the formless division of the mental plane, and other great ones may also sometimes come hither on some mission of compassion requiring such lower manifestation.
So remember that we said that the masters cannot be found on the astral plane. According to the Theosophical view, they very rarely they could be doing something on the astral plane, even more rarely on the physical plane in connection to people. Most of the communications of sensitive people are in general with entities on the astral plane. If the person is really developed and really pure, that person may communicate with entities on the mental plane. Now, even on the lower mental plane, it's rare to find the masters, although that is a little more common than on the astral plane. So, as we are going to see, the masters in general don't go below the highest subplane of the mental plane, and they work at the level of the souls, helping humanity at the level of the souls, rather than at the level of the personality that is so full of conditioning, just because of what I just said, that working on that level produces far deeper results than trying to break through the whole conditioning of the personality.
So the idea is for us to lift our consciousness to the level where the masters can communicate with us instead of them coming down here.
Yes, the more a person begins to live with a more universal consciousness, the more in tune that person will be for the influence that the masters are constantly pouring to help humanity. So if we are very self-centered, then we are not really in line with the influence because they are trying to stimulate the impersonal aspect. So that's the force that they are pouring or that they are working on will have an effect little by little on our higher consciousness, but the personality is not going to be able to receive much of this. If we try to live in a more impersonal way, then that influence can be brought even to the brain.
Okay, Alan has a question. I understand we can create thought forms continuously as we go through the day to help others and be of service. How can we best do this to make our efforts effective?
When the Buddha was asked the essence of his teachings, he said, cease to do evil, do good, and then something related to reaching Buddhahood. So I would say the first work, whenever we think, we produce a thought form. As we talked about in our previous class, that thought form will produce effects, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not. The stronger our thoughts, the stronger is this entity that we create, because thought forms, being ensouled by the elemental kingdoms, they become an entity. An ill thought will be a little demon, just to put it in a mythological way. A good thought will be a little angel. So I would say that our first stage is to cease to do evil, in the sense of let us work on being free from negative emotions and negative thoughts. By this I don't mean you will never ever again feel anger or fear or this, but there is a whole work that we have to do in that realm. First, the first step is to begin to be aware of how many times our mind and our mouth go off into negative thinking, negative talking. Many times we don't have anything to say. If we are all day talking, how many things can we say that are really meaningful? There are very little. So if you have to keep talking, you start gossiping. And when we gossip, we are generating all these little demons. So I would say the first step is to focusing on stopping our mind going into negative thinking and speaking. And for that we need to develop awareness so that we notice when this happens. We need to learn how to let go of negative states. As we do this, our thought begins to be a positive influence. So we can start trying to work on generating good thoughts. And I don't mean sequentially. You can do both things, at the same time. But I would put more emphasis on stop producing negative thinking. And then during the day, it is recommended, if you meditate in the morning, choose people that may need help, send good thoughts. And during the day, whenever something happens, we tend to get angry. Instead of getting angry, get compassionate. If a person, of course it's far more difficult if you are being attacked. If you are being attacked by a person, it's difficult to be compassionate. But many times, many things happen that we just get upset because we are intolerant. Instead of getting upset, try to be compassionate and send a good thought. And in very, easy, normal ways, we can do some good in this way. But I would say, and the second aspect is we need to work on having clear thinking. If our thinking is confused, superficial, then the thought forms that we generate are very feeble. Maybe that is good until we don't have a certain self-control. It's better that our thought forms are feeble so that our bad thoughts are not so sharp. But as you grow in this purification, then the next step is to try to have a very clear thinking. When you are clear about something, you generate a strong thought form. And then your good thoughts can have far more beneficial effects.
Okay, and Ed adds, service and sharing a healing energy are good practices.
Yes. And the energy work, either on the physical, emotional, mental levels, they are all good ways to help people.
Communications between intelligences functioning consciously on this plane, whether human or non-human, whether in or out of the body, is practically instantaneous, for it is with the speed of thought. Barriers of space have here no more power to divide, and any soul can come into touch with anyone by merely directing his attention to him.
I'm not sure if it was in this webinar or in some other that I mentioned that on the astral plane, the space on the astral plane depends on affinities, not on distance. So on the physical plane, you can run into a person only if you are spatially close. So at the level of space, you are close, you run into the person. On the astral plane, you run into a person if you have affinity with that person. On the mental plane, you, by directing your attention to somebody, to a place, to a situation, you are there. So what on the mental plane directs the motion is this this attention. And there, Annie Besant didn't talk about this, but on the astral plane, if you have to go through the astral plane to the other end of the world, then, because if your physical body is here, your astral body is here. If you want to, project the astral body to the other end of the world, there is some physical space that you have to cover. But on the astral plane, it may take a few seconds. On the mental plane, it doesn't take any time. It's instantaneous. And that's more or less how the difference as you go higher. On the Buddhic plane, which is a plane that is on top or above the mental plane, everything is in the same place. You are everywhere, as we are going to see.
It is said that love and hate both bind us. And so on the astral plane, when you talk about affinities, is there a negative and a positive affinity that will attract us to one another? Yeah, that's a good point. Affinity can be positive or negative. When you have feelings for a person, whatever those feelings are, those generate a bonding, a chain that ties you to that person, place, situation. Not only is communication thus swift, but it is also complete. If the souls are at about the same stage of evolution, no words fetter and obstruct the communion, but each sees the thought as conceived by the other. The real barriers between souls are the differences of evolution. The less evolved can know only as much of the more highly evolved as he is able to respond to. This question of communication, I think many of us may have had some experience, although probably you didn't notice it. But sometimes you read a book, you get a concept from a paragraph that you read. So 2 days later, you want to come back and find a paragraph, and you read it, and only half of what you understood is there actually written. You say, no, it said something else. It has to be somewhere else. It is said that when we read a book, if we are really concentrating on following the thought of the person, you can actually touch the idea on the mental plane. And then every idea on the mental plane it has many facets. So when the idea is produced by a person, it is produced as a whole, but when it comes through communication, we only get a little fragment of the person. This happens too with lectures. If you are in the lecture room and you hear somebody saying something and you get a whole comprehension that maybe you see the video again later, and because you are not in that state, you say, I thought he had said something different, or she had explained more. So on the mental plane, communication is complete. The whole idea with all the implications can be transmitted. Also, Annie Besant didn't mention this, but on the astral plane, it is said that there is still a barrier of language. Although you don't actually speak on the astral plane, if you try to communicate with people who speak another language, that is a barrier. I don't understand how that works. But the idea is that on the mental plane, you are beyond any language. It doesn't matter what kind of language, because you are connected with the idea. The mental plane has also its veils of illusion, though they be far fewer and thinner than those of the astral and the physical worlds. Each soul has its own mental atmosphere, and as all impressions must come through this atmosphere, they are all distorted and colored. The clearer and the purer the atmosphere, and the less it is colored by the personality, the fewer are the illusions that can befall it. So especially on the lower mental plane, our mental body has its own images there. So that produces a certain distortion. We all, on the physical plane, we all may perceive the same event, and we may perceive it in very different ways. As you go higher on the planes, this conditioning diminishes, but the mental plane is still a plane where there are conditionings. As the person evolves more and more, the inner bodies and the consciousness itself learns to respond to what is actually out there instead of being constantly reinterpreting things.
But as a general concept, the mental plane still has some conditioning. When you start perceiving on the Buddhic plane, you see things, and this is a symbolic way of talking, you see things as they really are. Or your consciousness becomes one with the object of perception, and you can actually understand what that is because you became that.
The three highest subdivisions of the mental plane are the habitat of the thinker himself. The vast majority live on the lowest level. In various stages of evolution, a comparatively few of the highly intellectual dwell on the second level.
So remember, we said the higher mental plane is the plane of the thinker, the ego, the soul. When in Theosophy we use the word ego, it's not in the psychological sense. Ego comes from the Greek and means I-ness. So the higher mental plane is the source of our sense of I-ness. You go beyond that and you are universal. So the thinker, the source of our sense of individuality, as we said, is on the higher mental plane. And the causal body is the vehicle of expression of that individuality. Now we said the higher mental plane has three subplanes. The most people are aware on the lowest of those three subplanes. Some people who are more awakened are on the second subplane, and very few are aware on the first subplane of the mental plane. The sense of I-ness that is on the mental plane is a very pure, quite impersonal sense of I-ness, this sense of existing, while the sense of I-ness we have here is associated to my body, my emotions, my mind. I am Pablo, therefore I am not this other person. Here again we can see the abstract sense of I-ness, just like the abstract sense of triangle, does not produce separation. The concrete sense of I-ness, I am Pablo, produces separation. Annie Besant liked to use the word thinker because she understood thinking in a different way as it is originally. But most of us, when we talk about thinking, we think of the psychological process of putting words together. So I don't particularly like to talk about the thinker in that way. This is, sometimes it is called the witnessing awareness. What we normally experience is how that witnessing awareness expresses itself through the brain.
At the stage now reached by the thinker, he is fully conscious of his surroundings and is in possession of the memory of his past. He knows the body he is wearing, through which he is contacting the lower planes, and is able to influence and guide them to a greater extent. He sees the difficulties, the obstacles they are approaching, the results of past careless living, and he sets himself to pour into them energies by which they may be better equipped for their task.
When Blavatsky examines this idea of the higher self and the lower self, or higher ego and lower ego, she says this is really a mystery, and it's not possible to explain it in any way with words, because it's a phenomenon that does not happen on the physical plane. So we don't have words or experience of this. The reason why I say this is because when you read a paragraph like this, it looks like the higher ego is something that is completely different from the lower ego. The higher ego is a different being, a different entity. Now, according to the Theosophical teachings, that is at the same time true and that is false, because it's a different kind of phenomenon that includes both, or that cannot really be defined by either. In a certain sense, we could take the example of you can talk about your angry self, your peaceful self, and you can say your peaceful self, if you are a spiritual person, tries to break through the angry self, meaning when you are angry, there is a part of you that is trying to break through that feeling, that is trying to remain at peace. So in a certain sense, there are two selves there. The one that wants to be angry, the other one that wants to break through, although it's only one single consciousness. To a certain extent, this happens with the higher and the lower ego. Although they may look like different, it is the same ray of consciousness, one that is completely conditioned by the physical and emotional and lower mental, and the other that is the unconditioned one. Now, at the level in which the lower conditioning doesn't exist, the higher ego knows all the previous lives, knows what he or she or it, because it doesn't have any gender, has to do in this life, how to deal with things. But then when that ray of consciousness tries to express that wisdom through the bodies and all the elementals and all these other influences, in general that clarity is lost. This is what Plato used to say: when the soul incarnates in the body, it goes through a river that produces this state of lack of memory of its true nature. So matter generates this kind of barrier. And the more we try to identify ourselves with the impersonal aspect in us, the less is this barrier between these two aspects of consciousness. All right, so we have to stop here. We went over our time. In our next class, we are going to see some other aspects of this, but we have some time for question and answers or comments. Is there anything you want to say or ask?
Yeah, the image I was thinking of was like an Olympic runner running through sludge. The potential is there if the road is flat for him to do it in 4 seconds, but the fact that he has to run through sludge means he could only express it much slower.
Yes. There are I have some other interesting, a few more interesting things that Annie Besant talks about here, but we will see it in our next meeting. I'll take it on our next class. But this is actually something quite important in how we act, because we think that our free will is whatever comes out of our thinking. So I decide to do this or that. Now, Annie Besant says the true action is the action that comes from this higher mind, and when the higher mind can really be expressed through the lower is compelled to do this. So it's not a decision of the lower. So from that point of view, what we call free will is actually a limitation or the lack of ability to act in conjunction with the higher mind. But that opens a whole new, can of worms. But it's an important aspect to discuss, so I will bring it for our next class.